Welcome to the Bennett-Schmidt Lectures on the Higher Aim of Art at Studio Incamminati. My name is Dan Thompson. I'm the Dean of Studio Incamminati, and I would like to welcome all of you, either in person or virtually, for spending some time with us this evening for the first of a very special series of lectures at Studio Incamminati on the Higher Aim of Art. I'd like to introduce to you Sam Knecht for tonight's lecture. Sam is Emeritus Professor of Art, Hillsdale College, where he taught continuously for over 4 decades. He taught a variety of painting, drawing, and art history courses, in addition to chairing the Department of Art. Among his most talented students was painter Nellie O'Leary, now teaching for Studio Incamminati. When Nell was a rising junior at Hillsdale College, Sam recommended she try the summer program offered at Studio Incamminati, and the rest is history. Elsewhere, Knecht taught at Kendall College of Art and Design, the School of Art at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and Spring Arbor University. He initiated an observational drawing course in a program in Florence, Italy, and co-hosted by the Universities of Michigan and Wisconsin and Sarah Lawrence College. For inspiration, Knecht has looked to American artists dedicated to the great figurative and landscape traditions. His short list includes the work of Wyeths, Sargent, and Hopper. He works variously in oils, egg tempera, and watercolor himself. His portraits have earned awards in members-only competitions hosted by the Portrait Society of America. Examples include the first place in watercolor in 2009. He's also done official portraits of 2 Michigan Supreme Court justices, 2 university presidents, among other civic and/or business leaders. In addition, he has painted many non-commissioned character portraits. Sam painted landscapes on location long before plein air became popular. He has taken his equipment to wilderness regions of northern Michigan, Ontario, throughout the Midwest, and on many trips to Italy. In 2016, he was an artist in residence in Michigan's Porcupine Mountains Wilderness Park. Publications include articles in American Artist Magazine, American Artist Studios Magazine, and International Artist Magazine in 2010. Sam is married to Dr. Melissa Knecht, Professor of Music, Hillsdale College. They and their daughters Lydia and Catherine enjoy life in their 1860s Gothic revival home in Hillsdale, Michigan. Sam's website is www.knechtstudio.com, and I'll spell it for you. That's K-N-E-C-H-T studio.com. And we're delighted to welcome Sam in his discussion, which is going to be fascinating, called The Strange Case of Ernesta by Cecilia Beaux. Sam?
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you all for coming and all of those that are attending remotely. It's such a pleasure to be honored with the invitation to come and speak at Studio Incamminati. I have felt for many years that Incamminati is the gold standard for teaching the great skill and heritage of representational art. So what a joy it is to be here today with you. Anyway, I want to give you a kind of a twofold approach in this talk. One purpose is to sketch out the development of Cecilia Beaux as a unexpected but phenomenal talent in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So what was her journey like? There was no prediction from her birth that she'd ever attain the success that she did. So there's part of the story is that, but the more intense story that I was obsessed with was a painting of her beloved niece Ernesta, and the painting actually was a large 6-foot-tall canvas in its inception, but when I first saw it in about 2012, it was cut into pieces. There were 2 large sections that survived, the rest gone. What a mystery this has been. Well, at any rate, let's get started here. So on the screen, you see presently the 2 canvases that I saw, and ultimately which were given to Hillsdale College, where I've been teaching. And it was quite a puzzle The owner of the canvases was a widow who lived as a recluse in Ann Arbor, Michigan. One of our development people from the college had been meeting with her, and he came back and said, Sam, she has paintings by somebody named Cecilia Beaux. Does that mean anything to you? And I said, you bet it does. And so one thing led to another, and I was introduced to her and saw the work. And she had some sketchy documentary material about these canvases. And all of this whetted my appetite to try to find out who'd done it, who would dare to cut a fine painting apart and leave fragments and have other portions missing. Now, who is Ernesta? And I'm going to be referring to her, or even the work at Hillsdale, as a title of Ernesta, only for convenience. It was not the original title that Cecilia Beaux gave to the work when it was first put in public exhibition. But the subject was her niece, Ernesta Drinker, and that's a close-up of Ernesta's face from the Hillsdale portrait on the left, and then a self-portrait by Cecilia Beaux. Well, now, for those out there who might not be all that familiar with Cecilia Beaux, there are some important highlights to emphasize. It's tempting and convenient to compare her to Mary Cassatt. There are points in common. Many are aware that Cecilia is ranked on par with Mary Cassatt. They're similar in their use of a warm, sensitive portrayal of human subjects, mothers and children, and so on. They both put their art careers ahead of their personal lives. And they broke into the good old boys club of high society painters and earned their respect. Neither Cecilia nor Mary Cassatt married, but they did have a rich life of closeness with their siblings and their extended families. In her day, Cecilia was compared favorably to John Singer Sargent. Generally, they were both skilled in doing large-scale portraits of celebrities and wealthy types with a virtuosic style. These were distinctive emblems of what is now called the Gilded Age. These symbolized elegance and refinement enjoyed by the privileged class. And of course, these things wound up in massive frames. Her talent was recognized by her peers. Miss Beaux, according to William Merritt Chase, is not only the greatest woman painter, but the best that has ever lived. So, it's big talk from William Merritt Chase. Cecilia Beaux' life story is practically one of a kind of female Horatio or Horatioana Alger, if one ever existed. The story starts with her grandmother, and I hope this won't get confusing, but her grandmother was from an offshoot of the Philadelphia Biddles. There are still Biddles in Philadelphia. We had one at Hillsdale College about a decade ago. At any rate, this woman married and, for business reasons, moved with her husband from Philadelphia to New York, where they settled for a while. That woman had a daughter who grew up, of course, fell in love with a Frenchman who was a silk merchant posted to the United States to peddle silk. So the grandmother and the Frenchman marry, and they unfortunately had a stillborn daughter. What a tragedy. And then they had two healthy girls that came into life a couple of years apart after that. But tragedy struck 12 days after Cecilia, the younger of the sisters, was born. Her mother died of an infection gained in the delivery of the child. So suddenly, these girls are without a mother. To make matters worse, not long after this, their grief-stricken French father abandoned the young girls into the care of the grandmother. And he fled back to France. Came back to the States a few times, sporadically over the years. But Cecilia and her somewhat older sister, Etta, were left in the care of their mother's mother. Grandma and the girls moved back to Philadelphia to enjoy some help and survival from the Biddles. Members of the Biddle clan kindly helped out, made sure there was good lodging and the girls got into good schools and so on. And things really started to improve when the girls were of marriageable age, and Etta, who's a lovely lady, married well. She married an up-and-coming attorney by the name of Henry Drinker. Now, that was his legitimate last name. He was not a drinker. Well, he was a drinker, but anyway, there is still a drinker at a law firm in Philadelphia with branch offices sprinkled throughout the country. So she married well. Etta did. Well, Cecilia and her sister, before that, attended some finishing schools in Philly, and then showing some artistic talent, Cecilia started private art studies in a small art school for girls. And the art training there was deeply rooted in disciplined observational drawing. So here's an example of Cecilia's studies of, well, there's a mandible and more in that drawing. Now, this was happening in Philadelphia, and she became aware of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, which I hope you'll be okay. I'll refer to it going forward as PAFA. Okay. Your rival school across town. Again, Incamminati, gold standard. Anyway, Cecilia reported going to visit exhibits at PAFA and was thunderstruck by seeing Benjamin West's Death on a Pale Horse, huge canvas illustrating an apocalyptic vision in Revelations. And you have to wonder about this one little detail you see on your screen, that it depicts a dead woman with carrying the body of a dead child, and then a wailing daughter, we presume, right alongside. So that must have resonated with Cecilia. So she might have wanted to attend PAFA, but her uncle, Will Biddle, who was providing most of the support, felt that PAFA was not fit for young ladies. They had prostitutes modeling in life classes. Heaven forbid. So she bypassed that, but studied elsewhere. Now, PAFA had a disastrous fire in 1870, and 6 years went by, during which time architect Frank Furness was hired to design the PAFA building, which now sits at the corner of Broad and Cherry, just north of City Hall. And Uncle Will was off managing mining operations in South America, so he wasn't around to complain, and Cecilia decided to enroll in PAFA. So by 1876, the new building there was operational, and one of the leading profs, really the most vibrant prof, was Thomas Eakins. But Eakins was controversial, as you may know. This is the Victorian age. His career at PAFA was plagued by some scandals, whether deserved or undeserved. And Cecilia decided to steer clear of Aikens, although she may have been impressed with his accomplishments. And it's possible that she had, it was very easy for her to have seen Aikens' huge masterpiece, the portrait of Dr. Samuel Gross performing a surgical operation. That had been displayed at the 1876 Centennial Exposition at Fairmount Park, and but it caused quite a stir in the press, being considered by the reporters as a painting unfit for women and children to look at. I mean, the surgeon had a scalpel and blood on his fingers, for God's sake. And you saw an open wound and forceps and so on in the thigh of a patient on the operating table. Also, if you don't know this painting, you may be struck by the oddity of the surgeon in brilliant light there wearing street clothes along with his assistants. All right, well, Cecilia is now ensconced in PAFA, takes the women's life painting and drawing classes, and performs well. After her stint at PAFA, she more or less graduates and starts gaining commissions to do portraits. Now, it helps to have a calling card if you try to enter that kind of a marketplace. And so she convinced her sister Etta to pose along with one of Etta's several children, Henry Drinker Jr. And so that's the painting that you see here. And so that started to help bring Cecilia to the attention of well-positioned folks in Philadelphia. Later on, Cecilia did this portrait of her brother-in-law, Etta's husband, Henry Drinker. This is in the National Portrait Gallery. It's more commonly known as Man with a Cat. And you can see this suave handling, very broad brush, painterly handling, and nice sense of simplicity of planes and more. Well, emboldened by her training and her growing success or notoriety, she felt this was the time to strike out on a new horizon, and she went to France. She had saved enough money and made the voyage, landed in Paris, took her portfolio, and was accepted in the school known as Académie Julian. And one of the principal profs that she worked with there was the celebrated William Adolphe Bouguereau, who was who took her seriously, and say more about that. After training at the French Academy, she spent some additional time during the summer elsewhere in France, in rural France, in a region known as Concarneau, and there she made a few landscapes. Landscape was never her passion, but she did portraits of peasant folks, such as you see here. One of her seldom done landscapes also visible. And here are a couple I think that are quite engaging, and they suggest that even though she was never afraid of contrast, her palette, especially with the two heads in the one with bonnets, that her palette was starting to lighten, perhaps under the influence of Impressionist masters that she was seeing. Well, after her stint in France, she comes back to Philadelphia, sets up a new studio with a cousin who was also an accomplished painter, a female cousin, and they started taking on commissions. There's a photo of a rather proud-looking Cecilia in the upper right of the screen. Another shot of Cecilia in profile, looking very prim and proper, but on the right is her portrait in pastel of none other than Mrs. Charles Darwin. So she's starting to hook up with the upper crust, if she hadn't already. And they didn't forget about her at PAFA. She was riding high. She became the first woman ever to be hired to teach at PAFA. She was put on jury committees at the Pennsylvania Academy and also the National Academy in New York City, where she'd been given full membership in that organization in 1895 when she was just 40 years old. Not bad. And here's a glimpse of her portrait around 1902, of Theodore Roosevelt's wife, Edith, I think it was Edith, and their daughter, Ethel. So she's really breaking into a higher echelon of clientele. Teddy Roosevelt managed to sit for a charcoal sketch, but the job of doing his official portrait fell to a man, of course, John Singer Sargent. All right, but she continued with a string of commissioned portraits. I love this one, Marion Riley, the Dean of Bryn Mawr College, which I think has a nice gesture, turning her shoulder toward the viewer, and very nice management of a key light and reflected light. But now we get to the mystery of Ernesta and these canvases that were cut apart. As I mentioned earlier, I had taught at Hillsdale College for many, many years. Nice school, fine school, well-heeled, but a fledgling art collection. So part of my mission as department chair was to try to build a collection of as important a work as we could manage to acquire. And I had been introduced to that widow that I mentioned earlier, and began visiting her on my own, arranging periodically to visit her as she lived as a recluse in her little apartment in Ann Arbor. I'd bring her grocery store flowers, bottles of Verner's ginger ale, which is a Michigan thing, and she loved that because she was a Michigan gal. And she was a notable woman in her own right. She was the first female accepted into the University of Michigan's engineering program back in the, I think, the 1950s, and survived all of that. She happened to marry well, and her husband was a plastic surgeon. And I remember seeing that the woman, Annie Natvig, that she and her husband were fond of buying portrait paintings. They had one which I'm pretty sure was a fake, but it was labeled with a tag suggesting it was a Sargent. Probably not. But they had a very unique and fine collection. And when it came to the Cecilia Beaux paintings, I was fascinated to learn that she had old black and white 8x10 photographic prints that traced the changes that had been made in this painting of Ernesta, which in its first state, as you see here, has a fulsome space. Ernesta sitting on a little chair. It's kind of spindly looking for all that figure resting on that little chair. But it's an interior, very shadowy, and you see a figure in the background, and a curtain, and a chest of drawers, and light filtering from the background toward the front space. And then in the second state, there's another photograph that shows the guy missing. What's going on here? And in the third state, it's no longer an interior, it's now, well, an exterior nocturne, which is a little hard to figure out. Where do you get all that bright lighting in the early 1900s at twilight with all that darkness around? Well, what's going on here? Why all these changes? Let alone why was it cut down? Who did it was what was really bugging me. And while time went forward and I was trying to romance this fine lady into the idea of giving the paintings to Hillsdale, I started researching as much as I could about the backstory of Cecilia Beaux, looking for clues. I learned that the painting initially was done in Cecilia Beaux' private art studio in Gloucester, Massachusetts. You'll get a glimpse of that going forward. Now, what I've done here is to Photoshop the surviving two canvases against the original photo of the painting, which of course appears in black and white. The owner, Anne Natvig, only knew that Ernesta herself had sold the reduced paintings to a Boston dealer in 1970. In turn, he sold them to the Natvig couple when Anne's husband was still alive, about 5 years later. There's no question of forgery. In fact, I think we'll have a better close-up later on, but just beneath the shoes in the lower left canvas is Cecilia's signature. All right, I did a lot of research, a lot of reading. Cecilia, who was rather self-important in an endearing way, wrote an autobiography, which she published in 1930 in mature middle age. And ironically, she titled the biography, or the autobiography, Background with Figures. And for me, that's ironic because her painting of Ernesta started out with a figure and then she eliminated it from the background. Anyway, there's a fine book by an art historian named Alice Carter, which you see pictured here, which is found invaluable in learning about Beaux' career. But a real gold mine of research appeared when I learned that Cecilia Beaux' personal papers, all kinds of documents, including her diaries, have been digitized and can be found easily online through a wing of the Smithsonian Institute called the Archives of American Art. All manner of important American artists have their documents archived that way. What a great service that is to American culture. And so I learned that Cecilia Beaux had many, many years worth of diary entries which were typed, hammered out on a manual typewriter. Why would she do that? Well, the reason most likely is that somewhere in early adulthood, she began to experience some discomfort in her right hand, and that was her painting hand. And so I think it gave her some relief from not stressing that hand so much to type. Well, there are archives that helped with all of this, not only for Cecilia, but for Ernesta. Ernesta's papers are housed at Georgetown University in Washington, and Cecilia's documents are spread between the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art here in town, as well as the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And Gloucester became the summer home for Cecilia once she achieved great monetary success. And all kinds of success fell to her, including getting an honorary degree at a Yale University commencement exercise, 1912. And she was given a second honorary degree from the University of Pennsylvania, a degree called a Doctor of Law. Go figure. In addition, earlier in the year that she painted the Ernesta painting that we are studying here, she had a one-woman show at the Corcoran in Washington, which sadly, as many of you probably know, has closed. This beautiful, important gallery around the corner from the White House. But speaking of beautiful buildings, now we get a glimpse of the home that Cecilia had constructed for herself in Gloucester. She named it Green Alley on account of when the property was bought, it was all decked out with all manner of trees and walkways under tall bushes and gardens and so on. Well, she always loved things French, and she must have seen enough French architecture during her time in that country that she wanted to have her summer home take on a French flavor. You see an old black and white photograph of this. The location of this house is on a narrow neck of land that juts out into the Atlantic, framing Gloucester Harbor. Some of you might know about Gloucester from the cable TV series Wicked Tuna, where they're always sailing their fishing boats out of Gloucester. The larger shot here in color is a glimpse of Green Alley. Not so green right now because it was wintertime a few years ago when I was able to get a hold of that photograph. This is the face that faces toward Gloucester Harbor. But I got special permission this past summer to visit Green Alley. The present owners, I had nominal contact with them, and they agreed, the private ownership, they agreed to let my wife and two daughters and I visit Green Alley, spend about an hour there walking around with them and seeing the beauty of the place. Not bad for an artist back in 1906 or whenever Green Alley was put up. It's another view, a lot of beautiful landscaping, floral gardens, and so on. Here's a glimpse of one section, exterior section of her studio, which is a building separate from the main house. And the present owners, actually twin brothers that are probably in their 50s, they are very carefully but slowly renovating the property, the two big buildings. And so you see some scaffolding inside her studio in this shot, but rather imposing fireplace and exposed timber framing in the ceiling system. So a nice summer getaway. So much for having an Airstream pull-behind trailer. Now for wintertime, even though she had strong connections with Philadelphia, she preferred to live in an apartment in New York City, in Manhattan, on Gramercy Park, which is, I think, today where the National Art Club is located, or the Salmagundi Club. So this is just a generic shot of some house fronts in Gramercy Park. But getting back to Green Alley for some highlights, she was so successful that she had staff at Green Alley. On the left, in this old black and white photograph, you see her houseman, Natale. Natale, folks, was a retired Venetian gondolier. Now, what well-positioned single woman wouldn't want to have a retired gondolier running around and doing things for her? She also had a gardener. There was a big article in something like McCall's magazine about the beauty of the landscaping of her house. She had arrived. The woman in the black outfit with her back to us is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Think Whitney Museum. In one corner of the lot, she had a 3-arch loggia constructed. And you see a shot of that yet today. And an old photograph of a maid in the archway. So she had a gardener, a gondolier, and a housemaid. And loved to socialize. Here's an existing photograph where Cecilia is seated in a Windsor chair, and to the left of her on the screen is a young, standing Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The fellow off to the right is a wonderful professor of economics from Harvard University, Piet Andrews, who himself made so much money teaching economics at Harvard that he put up a huge mansion just down the road from Cecilia's green alley. And there was a lot of socializing, party giving. These wealthy neighbors would sometimes get together and have soirees and enact little dramatic happenings. There's Cecilia, second from the left. And she loved the company of men, even though she didn't marry. A young artist named Thornton Oakley, who had been a student of Howard Pyle, was a frequent guest. But one of her most treasured guests was her niece, Ernesta, Sister Etta's daughter. Here's a painting Cecilia did of her when she was just a toddler. And notice the cropping of this. You have to wonder about maybe an influence from Degas, whose work it's easy to presume she had seen while in France. She painted or drew Ernesta more than anyone in her career. For example, on the left is her charcoal sketch of Ernesta, age 10. And there's a photograph of just Ernesta for comparison just a few years later as a teenager. Ernesta would often come and spend practically the whole summer with Aunt Cecilia at Green Alley, giving plenty of opportunity to pose as a model. There's Ernesta in the middle. This was a part of Cecilia's papers. That's Cecilia's own handwriting, so she just abbreviates that she's CB, then Ernesta in the middle, and a person whom I can't figure out on the right. Ernesta posed for this somewhat mythical-looking painting, Girl with a Lyre. We're leading up to the time of painting the Hillsdale and Ernesta canvases. But what about Ernesta? Here she is in middle age, looking quite beautiful, I must say. Her dates there, lived a very long life, but a photo taken about 1930. She was aristocratic, led a very curious and unorthodox life. 2 marriages, at least one torrid love affair between marriages. And I guess she was so aristocratic, cultured, beautiful. It's claimed that she had at least 50 proposals of marriage before her story was through. Well, Ernesta kept her own diary in her own handwriting, and I was able to read that at Georgetown, and here is her commenting on her own good looks. And I quote, "There was never any attempt to conceal the fact that I had beauty any more than one would have hidden from others the truth that the flowers in the garden were lovely. It was a gift from the gods who had made my Provençal ancestors beautiful men." So even though Ernesta really did not know her grandfather, the Frenchman Beaux, nevertheless, I guess she thought it was convenient at the least to cite her connection, her gene pool, as being French. All right, well, back to Cecilia's diaries. I finally struck pay dirt when we came across the section where she said in October 3rd of 1912 that E sat down, that's short for Ernesta, wrapped in the curtain on a low chair. Wonderful. And I was at once fired with it, had no canvas wide enough, and had to stop and wait, and after lunch, telephoned Hatfield for it. I think it was our own Dan Thompson here who told me that Hatfield was the name of the art supplier in nearby Rockport. Is that right, Dan? Dan says it sounds about right. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, at any rate, here we go with a close-up. Little by little, fragmentary notations in the diaries emerged, talking about the progress of this painting. And recalling those episodes decades later, Ernesta, in a letter, described the challenges that Cecilia had faced with the drapery choice. Primarily, her aunt, she wanted to paint the purple and gold curtain in which I was wrapped each day. This was not a dress. It was just curtain fabric that they took a hold of. The great difficulty lay in getting the folds of the brocade to look somewhat the same each day. Occasionally, it was so impossible, no painting at all was done. Excuse me. Cecilia's portraits typically display suave handling of fabric. It should be no wonder, since Amelia's French father was in the silk business. Just the same, it should be noted that he was an absentee parent who rarely visited his daughters in America after the death of his wife. So some of the love of cloth was probably more attributed to the grandmother, who taught Cecilia as a young girl how to sew and was a stern taskmaster or mistress, I might say. If she didn't do a seam right, Grandma would make her pull it out and redo it. Well, here's what we know about Cecilia's work habits, her discipline. She'd spend 3 or 4 hours each morning at her easel. Art students take note, at least 3 or 4 hours. Now, she's probably in her 50s by the time this painting was done, maybe even 60-ish. Unless invited, no one should come in and disturb the work with the model. However, sometimes one of Ernesta's friends might be allowed to come in and read aloud to the model. We suppose it kept the young woman alert while sparing Cecilia the distraction of small talk. And what would be read? Well, we know from the diaries that one of the books being read and probably discussed was something called The Egoist by author George Meredith, who the plot pretty much surrounds the problems of women who feel straitjacketed by husbands or suitors intent upon furthering themselves in business and caring very little for a balanced relationship. Now, it seems likely that Ernesta and Cecilia might also have discussed ongoing news about the women's suffrage movement that was in full force by 1912, again, the year that the Ernesta painting was produced. At least one uninvited guest came when Piet Andrews burst in one day to explain that Teddy Roosevelt had been shot. He'd been on the campaign trail as an independent candidate that year, and while delivering a speech, somebody shot him in the chest. Fortunately, he survived because the bullet hit a sheaf of papers in his breast pocket, and that blunted the force of the bullet, and he went on talking for another 2 hours. So here we have some context for the story of the Ernesta painting. By November 9th, after 5 weeks of work, the painting was finished. Ernesta departed, presumably to rejoin her parents in Pennsylvania. And now Cecilia, perhaps a little more alone feeling, could relax and enjoy the comfort of the living room in the big house at Green Alley, an old photo, and then a photo taken just this past summer. Well, back in Manhattan by the holidays, Cecilia arranged to enter the Ernesta painting in the 1913 Spring Annual Members Exhibit of the National Academy. It was freshly varnished and framed, and the painting was installed. In those years, the National Academy was housed in a grand building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, but exhibited in the Art Students League on West 57th Street. Cecilia's painting was hung in its Vanderbilt Gallery in the renowned so-called place of honor at the head of the main stairs. And again, I have to thank Dan Thompson for enlightening me about what it meant to be in the place of honor, in that location at the head of stairs. As you walked up, bam, it would you couldn't ignore it. It was high tribute to her by her peers. On March 15th, 1913, the Academy show opened. Cecilia titled the painting simply Portrait Study. An unpretentious title, but it speaks of the painting as an exploration, I'd like to think. The painting was a non-commissioned work, what some might call an inner assignment. It was painted at the Green Alley home, as you know, and it was a serious form of homework. Not just a likeness, it was a composition with hints of the Green Alley studio interior with the white-clad figure of Natale in its background. Remembering the first public appearance of this work, we will now take another look at the Ernesta paintings, again with this superimposition. Well, here now is the cover of a program for that National Academy show. And open it up, and after a page or two, bam, there you see Portrait Study by Cecilia Beaux there in halftone, black and white, and listed in the program. Again, another honor afforded to her by her colleagues in the Academy. What's more is the painting was written up in all of the New York City newspapers, most notably the New York Times. Yes, an article review of the National Academy show survives in the documents of the New York Times. And here's a partial mention of the Cecilia Beaux painting. In the place of honor, in the Vanderbilt Gallery, hangs a figure painting by Cecilia Beaux, an orchidean color scheme of purple and brazen yellow, a blue and yellow headdress surmounting or rather swathing her small head, her extremely pretty feet in silken white. The brush has had its say in very few words, but they are precisely the right ones. And this is early in the review, by the way. It's not an addendum. He goes on to say, and there are the feet, witty and pretty and perfectly expressed, with that old delicacy and lightness of statement practiced by the artist when she was painting the Gilder children dancing. Miss Beaux has done work in which her public must take pride, both deep and sincere. Not bad. The reviewer went on to weave in a few lines of critique, though, that implied that while Beau's audience was accustomed to seeing unquestioned masterpieces by the painter, but there were portions of this work that ought to be reconsidered. He wrote, "There is still something to do with the portrait, and it will emerge worthy of the brilliant talent dedicated to it." So, not exactly A+ praise. New York Tribune also did a write-up on the show with many lines praising Cecilia's work. I'm not going to drag you through all of that, but there were, I think, perhaps 6 or 7 different press clippings in Cecilia's paper. She was really brilliant. If she was mentioned, she had a clipping service that would find things, and she probably paid to, have them clip them and send them to her. So those are all in her archives. But this one I think we have to deal with. This is great fun. Sometime about a year later than the National Academy show, the Academy held a student lighthearted caricature show. And one student concocted a lampooned portrait study with a nod to the now infamous Marcel Duchamp painting, Nude Descending a Staircase. So I have the student mock-up on the left and the Duchamp Nude Descending a Staircase on the right. The student had clipped the newsprint image of Ernesta, placed it over a photo of a side view of a banister, and cut a slit in the paper, and with attached strings, you could move this cut-out paper doll figure of Ernesta up and down the staircase ramp. It's pretty cute. And not only that, but this puckish student identified the artist as Cecilia Beaux. And then Cecilia, with her own hand on the margin of this, wrote huffily, "This is not by Cecilia Beaux. This is not CB." Well, what about Duchamp? Okay, what was happening across town at the same time the National Academy show was making its appearance, the infamous and influential Armory show opened at a National Guard armory. And that was the show that really rocked the art world in the United States, because it brought in European modernism, Van Gogh, Duchamp, Brancusi, and more, and presented it to American audiences. And many of you probably know about how seminal that was in American history. It's like the lines were drawn then between purely observation-oriented representational artists on the one hand, and those that wish to be in the avant-garde and experimental with their approaches. And let's say, tradition be damned. It was like a death knell to the Gilded Age. Well, anyway, back to the Ernesta painting, with praise but also chiding from the art critics, and even whimsical teasing from an impudent art student. What was Cecilia to do? Leave things alone? Or go back to work on portrait study? Well, she went back to work, but she also decided, well, I'll just do a fresh painting of Ernesta, which you see here. And the Metropolitan liked it, so much so that they paid $3,000 for it in 1914. You know, accounting for inflation, that would be over $72,000 in today's money. But again, back to the first state, there's Natale. Sometime in the next 4 years, she goes back to work on it and eliminates the figure in the background. Doesn't touch the figure, doesn't touch the chair. These are from unaltered, unfaked photos. And then by 1917, now we're outside at twilight, like I suggested earlier, and it's retitled too. It's called On the Terrace. Now, the painting went in and out of exhibits thereafter for decades. So what we have here, since I mentioned On the Terrace, well, Green Alley has a lovely terrace with a great view of the harbor. An old photo on the left and a current photo with beautiful landscaping and an unbroken view of the harbor and the boat traffic. Well, fast forward to 1927, Cecilia began writing her autobiography, which she titled, as I said, Background with Figures. It was published 3 years later, and On the Terrace was actually reproduced in that book. Our college library has a copy of that, and it was one of maybe no more than about 16 black and white plates in her autobiography. So if it's going to be in her autobiography toward the end of her life, odds are it's still intact. Now, she also was enjoying even more honors. She was inducted to the National Institute of Arts and Letters and given a one-person show in their New York building in about 1935. And On the Terrace was included in that show and listed in the catalog. So where do we go from there? What was the fate of this painting in the ensuing years? Who cut it down? Was it Cecilia Beaux herself in a fit of anger or pique? Or was it Ernesta? We did learn that the painting was bequeathed to Ernesta. And to fact check that, somehow my path led to contacting the New York City Office of Probate. And the probate office very kindly emailed me a scan of Cecilia Beaux' will, something like 12 pages worth of information. And on this one page, there's a listing of what she bequeaths to her niece, Ernesta Drinker. By then, she's on her second marriage, Ernesta Drinker Barlow. And down in the list here, or in item number 2, Portrait on the Terrace. Okay, so the painting, we can assume, is intact when Cecilia passes away and Ernesta gets her hands on it. Well, again, let's flesh out Ernesta's story a little bit more, her ups and downs. A couple more glimpses of her as this elegant lady with the bobbed hair and so on. On the left is husband number one, William Bullitt, who was actually in the delegation that President Woodrow Wilson sent to Paris to work out the Treaty of Versailles when the Allies beat the Germans at the end of World War I. And William Bullitt could speak Russian. Apparently, he was going to have to be the one to handle Lenin, the Bolshevik leader of Russia, in his involvement with the Treaty of Paris. Now, I want to just do a little aside here because it was fascinating to read Ernesta's diaries, in which she mentions that she and Billy, William, went to a dinner, and she was seated next to a very short Englishman, and who was very talkative. Once she plied him with some comments about the Middle Ages and so on. And when the party broke up and the guests left, Ernesta was left with a few of her closer friends there and her husband. And she said, well, who was that Englishman? And the others just laughed and said, Ernesta, that was Lawrence of Arabia. So anyway, this was a crowd she was running with at that time. But things went sour with husband William Bullitt. She divorces him. As time goes forward, in the 20s, maybe the 30s as well, she's single, and she decides to make ends meet by doing interior design work for her wealthy friends. And in that, but eventually, she hooks up with husband number two by the 40s and 50s. His name was Samuel Barlow, who was a well-off composer in New York. Obviously, a name that I doubt anyone in our audience would recognize, but I think he had more position than talent, but he had money. But what about in between? Well, one of her lovers was artist Rockwell Kent, a brilliant engraver. I don't think I should have gotten privileges to show shots of his love letters that Ernesta kept that are in her papers at Georgetown. They're pretty steamy. And, he was signing them with my dearest, and we'll be a great partnership. We'll be architects together or something like that. And it was very suggestive, the language that I read in his letters to her. Well, in the meantime, when not distracted by suitors like Rockwell Kent, she did interior design work. Here's a room she designed for some wealthy client in Dayton, Ohio, of all things. You could see that this old school sense of elegance and opulence was very much on her mind. And she even began to refer to herself as, not as Ernesta Drinker or Ernesta Barlow or whatever, but Ernesta Beaux, training on her aunt's good name and maybe pushing the French button as well. Well, with husband number two, Sam Barlow, one of the things that they ventured off to do was to go to France and buy crumbling old buildings overlooking the French Riviera, which they had restored. And this place called Edza became a kind of hangout for artists and writers and glittering intelligentsia. It was observed somewhere that when the Barlows sailed to France to spend time in the Riviera, they would go by boat, of course, and then they would arrange to get near the Riviera coastline, and then they would be taken by a special small boat to the shoreline as close as possible to their lavish villa there. Well, here's the problem. They were careless about keeping track of their money. There's an article in the Gloucester archives that explains in an interview with an aged Ernesta that one day their accountant came to them and said, "The money's all gone." They had been spending away the principal of their investments without paying attention to that. So their circumstances were, as they say, vastly reduced. And so they lived in a small apartment. She still tried to do some interior design work, but I read that she even bought blank wooden trays and then gold leafed them and sold them to her friends. I saw dress patterns in her archives that suggested that maybe she learned how to sew and was making some of her own clothing in old age. Now, Cecilia had bequeathed Green Alley to Ernesta's brother, Henry Drinker Jr., the little boy in the painting of Etta and the little boy. But he allowed the couple to live in the studio as the years of the late 1940s and 50s went forward. So can you make out that framed little area there? That shows Ernesta on one of the side patio porches of Green Alley. And here she is with a couple of unidentified fellows, well, at least not important to us, in the middle with her pure snowy white hair easily visible. Now, while hanging out at Green Alley, she took advantage, privileged advantage of using the house stationery. So what we have here is a letter that she wrote to a Murray Bromson in I think New York, who was a bookseller and a collector, and she's basically saying, "I'm delighted to have you buy this painting, which she thought she had posed for in 1914, but that was an incorrect recollection if we look at Cecilia's diaries about that." Now later on, Bromson decides to have the picture, or maybe pictures by this time, evaluated by an art restorer. And the art restorer writes back to Bromson here, and these two letters were in the documents that I was able to study at Mrs. Natbig's apartment during my visits. But at any rate, this fellow reports to Bromson, well, okay, the condition of the work, well, it's been cut apart, and I've noticed some tears, or at least one tear that has been repaired. I've been able to see that in the original, beautiful and expert repair behind Ernesta's head in the actual canvas. Now, this is another letter to the bookseller, Bromson, written by a registrar at PAFA, who mentioned in about 1974 that they were considering mounting a solo exhibit of Beaux' work, and they were thinking about maybe including the Ernesta painting. But he realizes, or that the registrar realizes that the head of PAFA at the time, Frank Goodyear, decided against using the Ernesta painting. But that doesn't really tell us anything meaningful about the condition of the work at that time. But by the time the Natbigs bought the work in the 70s, it had been cut down. Well, now this begs the question, why were the shoes saved? I mean, you could see the portrait as kind of waist length as being a kind of standalone piece. But why the shoes? Well, two things. It has the signature of the artist, and it also was probably a recollection to Ernesta. It was probably part of family legend that the New York Times reviewer had remarked so favorably about the handling of those shoes, those pretty, witty shoes. And cloth, you know, silk shoes, for goodness sake, you know. The family loved silk, at least the grandfather did. So I say circumstantial evidence points to Ernesta being the one who had the painting cut down. And its surviving surviving sections reframed for sale. Ernesta, we know, had become hard up for money to the point she was buying those wooden trays and doing other things to make ends meet. And among her papers, like I said, there were these dress patterns. Why would you save dress patterns? But at any rate, you can imagine that with changing of tastes and time, that it would be harder to sell a painting that's 6 feet tall. And you know, how many people have Manhattan apartments that have 12, 15-foot ceilings and so on? So there might have been a sales incentive that had these cut down. I think equally possible was damage to the painting in other sections that are now missing. Perhaps careless handling, taking it from one place to another. It's not hard to cut a rip through a canvas, a linen canvas. But it's very hard to repair it so that it shows no trace of repair. It's very expensive. Yes, there is a repair to the right of Ernesta's head beyond the headdress, but it certainly doesn't show up in these photographs, but on close inspection, you can tell where that occurred. The painting has been relined for you technicians out there. That means good quality linen has been archivally adhered to the back of the canvas to stabilize it. So it's not like you can look in the back and see a sewn tear. But at any rate, I think that Ernesta just had to peddle it, and that accounted for its fate going forward. So eventually by 2015, Mrs. Natvig donated these works to Hillsdale College. And I was extremely pleased about it. We do happen to have a majority of our art majors that are women. I think it's very important for them to have important role models. It's not the only work in our small collection that is by a woman artist, but it's certainly the most notable one. In fact, part of what I assigned myself to do on this whole project was to get an updated appraisal of the value of these canvases. I initially went to an estate outfit in Detroit, Michigan, which does all the big money estates. They blew it off. They said, oh, they're probably worth 20 grand. Well, I learned eventually that IRS will question an appraisal of a piece of art if it's valued by an appraiser for more than 20 grand. So I think this was just take care of this project, blow it off by saying it's worth 20 grand. Well, I took it to another appraiser who did about a year's worth of research with Christie's and Sotheby's. They looked at the market for Cecilia Beaux paintings, and they came back with a conservative estimated value of $450,000, which I thought was probably more correct. But Annie Natvig gave these to Hillsdale, where they are the centerpiece of our collection. And that brings me to wonder, what lessons should we take from this story of Cecilia Beaux and Ernesta? Well, among other things, like Cecilia, we should listen to the criticism of the well-qualified. It's safe to assume Cecilia read those critics' views and resolved to improve portrait study. 2, don't be afraid to alter work when it honestly needs it. Elsewhere, expect and endure occasional episodes of misgiving and redirection. For all the confidence of her technique, Cecilia had some doubts sometimes, and she learned to work past it. Now, for the owners of a work like this, I feel owners, collectors bear a responsibility to protect the work from injury. Sorry, Ernesta, shame on you if you really were the one who had it cut apart. As artists, we should continue to do work that is non-commissioned, to pursue our inner assignments. Free from constraints in the tastes for ill or not of a client, we should assign our own challenges to master. The Ernesta paintings may or may not be among Cecilia Beaux' best works, but they represent her best efforts. Finally, artists need community, whether friends, colleagues, family, or Studio Incamminati. Cecilia may have lived in an elegant world, consciously shielded from commoners, but she genuinely adored her circle, and she frolicked with them and drew inspiration from them. So she played the hands she was dealt. And when you think about her being basically orphaned as an infant to rise to the station she did in life and to accomplish a wonderful technique and body of work, she deserves serious consideration. And finally, to all of you who love art and all of those of you who are studying art, it is seriously incumbent upon you to learn art history, to learn what those who've gone before you have done, what their struggles and adventures, highs and lows have been, and to learn from that. You did not invent yourself, and you need to pay close attention to the tradition in which you find your place. Thank you.
Sam, I have a question myself, if I may.
Yeah.
I'm holding the mic. What a remarkable presentation. And I want to applaud you, first of all, for that, because it's so interesting and I think so meritorious to have gone into the archives and looked and learned from the archives. But I know that you tried hard to bring the actual works here. You tried to bring the original pieces, and I've seen them, and they're beautiful. But my question is, as the choreographer of this presentation, what would you have hoped us to get from the original pieces above and beyond the obvious? What would you have hoped we learned from seeing them in the original state?
Yeah, I guess my presentation has a history and a story, a narrative but when you look at these paintings in the flesh, there is a fluidity of technique, a grace in the touch. They're not overworked. The treatment of the hands is marvelous. There's nothing finicky going on in this. It's not like some amateur that's striving to get every little fingernail easily readable and so on. They're very optical in a way that I think Sargent's work was optical. You just drive the best you can to put down what the eye sees. Of course, Sargent was accused of being, non-judgmental, non-editorial, whatever, which is kind of unfair. But they're just brilliantly executed. And, there are qualities that the painters would appreciate. The thick and thin, thin glazes in the dark background, robustly rich but fluent impasto in the areas of form and in the light, and a translucence in the skin of her face, and soft edges too. The sense of a figure enveloped in an atmosphere of space. You know the language on this, folks. The management of light and dark and edges is really superb. Now, as far as I did make efforts to try and bring these here to Philadelphia, but the college money handlers were a little reluctant. They felt it was just a little too much of a risk, particularly because I'm not employed by the college anymore. So, would the insurance policy entrust someone who is not an employee of the college to manage the care and conduct custody and control of the paintings for just a one evening lecture? So, sorry about that.
Thank you.
Oh, hey, yeah, we need to use the mic.
First of all, that if you had brought the paintings, it could have been the next chapter in the, if you'd absconded to France with them, say. At any rate.
Yeah.
You were talking about her diaries?
Yes.
And how could somebody, you say it's online, that we could, how would you go about?
Yeah, you just go to Google the Smithsonian Institute, and maybe even go directly to the Archives of American Art. And there you can find in alphabetical listings all the papers that they have thus far digitized for American artists, sculptors, painters, photographers, and more. And it's a treasure trove of information for anyone who has a passion for a particular artist or is a bona fide art historian.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Fascinating. Thanks.
Yeah, there's a question over here.
You answered my question about what you think are the excellencies of the portrait. I've got two questions. It almost seems as though the artist is more interested in the drapery than in the model. So that's one thing you might comment on that. And also the elimination of the other figure. Because with the figure in it, there's a narrative suggestion that's missing. And maybe Beaux thought, I don't want this to be a narrative painting. I want it to be a portrait or a study of the drapery.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you're pointing to the aesthetics of this, the compositional difficulties, which are there. I think they were there at the outset. I don't think the painting was improved by removing Natali. In fact, if you want to be brutally honest about it, her figure sort of cuts the painting on a diagonal line from upper right to lower left. And it just sort of splits the canvas space into two triangular sections as a result. And she's sitting on this ridiculously small chair, for goodness sake. She looks way too big to be adequately supported by that spindly little ladder-back chair. So when I said, we shouldn't be afraid to alter a picture, it doesn't mean we're going to improve it. In this case, she may not have, and I do think it is strange to have the final iteration being at nighttime, out on the terrace, but she's still just as brilliantly bright in values as she was in the first go-around. And yet, it's not like a spotlight's been brought in to light her from the front, because there's no cast shadows streaking back from the chair legs, for example. So she fiddled with it, not necessarily for better. We might have a remote audience member asking a question.
You can read my mind, Sam. Thanks to Nell for forwarding these questions. I have two. I'll give you the first one first. Would you please speak about the process of researching and acquiring paintings of great historical and technical merit for a school or personal collection?
Oh my. Well, the Cecilia Beaux paintings were kind of a one-off for my tenure at Hillsdale College. I do want to credit the college for supporting faculty in research. I got a modest research grant that funded coming from the Midwest to these East Coast archives. And, and then myself I did a lot of gumshoe art history work just from my office with phone calls to like Frank Goodyear, the former head of PAFA, who was still alive at least 6 years ago. And he opined that, Ernesta never would have cut that painting down. Well, sorry, Frank, I beg to differ. You can't find any other culprit. But I guess reflecting on trying to build a collection for an institution, it's never going to be easy. It just depends on the resources of the institution and what the mission is that is driven by the institution. In this case, Hillsdale is a liberal arts college, which likes the arts, but has its mind on other majors as well. So, little by little with some discretionary funds over the course of 3 decades of chairing the department, the Ernesta paintings were the pinnacle, but we also have works by Harvey Dinnerstein and another academician from the National Academy, Priscilla Roberts from the 1940s and 50s. She has work in the Smithsonian. And we have, whenever we've had a solo show of a good regional artist come to Hillsdale, we try to buy an individual work out of that show to keep increasing our collection. Having a first-class art collection, I must confess, is not uppermost on the minds of the college president and his inner circle. But nevertheless, little by little, it's growing and getting better. And we had another question, Dan?
Yes, your segue was brilliant. And could you talk a bit about Hillsdale's art program, please?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that would be a delight. Our program, even though I'm retired, was and continues to be a staunch advocate of traditional training in studio art. The studio expertise in the department is principally painting, drawing, sculpture, as far as the fine arts, but also supportive allies with more applied arts of photography and computer graphics. We also have a strong art history curriculum in the art major and available to art minors and other students. It was always my passion that we should have a really strong balance between 2D, 3D, and art history. And so we graduate about, on average, 12 art majors each year out of a graduating total class of 300 or so. Total enrollment at Hillsdale is presently about 1,500. It's been growing a fair amount lately. But the art major, now it is a liberal arts college, so anyone who would consider seriously attending Hillsdale for art has to realize that there's a limit on what you can take in a major in a liberal arts college. And it might be only about 30 or 40% of the curriculum that you have to take overall. And that's sometimes a little frustrating for us in the art department and for students as well. So we've had students sometimes spend not just a full 4 years, but do an extra semester or even an extra year because they like the program. But it's one of the few programs around the country, as I can tell, that is allied to traditional training in studio. And by the way, it makes this a little bit difficult to place people in graduate schools because Master of Fine Arts programs are throwing craftsmanship and traditional technique to the winds. There's just a small number, and that's why when I learned about Studio Incamminati, as I did maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I thought this is a place to keep an eye on. And it could be a future home for some of our best and brightest. And Nellie O'Leary is a good example of that.
I thank you for that, and I want to thank everyone who joined us virtually this evening for supporting the Studio Incamminati creative community. Please keep an eye out for our upcoming lectures. We have some coming up having to do with our panel discussion related to demonstrations, and we have another special guest coming in November, so keep an eye on your email account. And also the format. We may do some in YouTube, we may do some on Zoom, but we look forward to the next interaction that we all have, and thanks again for being a part of tonight's ceremonies.